Almost 100 years ago, B.H. Roberts, a magisterial historian of church history, made a remarkable comment speaking of the Restoration, and with all due deference to the prophet Joseph Smith's role in the Restoration, Elder Roberts said that there were earlier lights in the morning than the rising sun. That there was much in the twilight zone of the coming morning that spoke of other great men and women worldwide that expand the stage, if you will, of the Restoration and make it so much more expansive than perhaps we've ever anticipated or dreamed possible. What I wish to discuss is what was in the air of 1820. What was the time like? What were the main currents of thought that colored that time and age, that may have not necessarily anticipated the Restoration, but were happening simultaneously to it, and may have had enormous impact upon it as time goes on. And one of the very first things I think we'd have to look at would be the spirit of revolution in the age of 1820, and those who made that so possible and so real. And it's considered by most scholars today that the real spirit of the age of 1820, I'm speaking worldwide now, is Napoleon Bonaparte. He is still, to this day, considered the spirit of the age. Now, what was it about Napoleon that seems to capture this? To understand that, we have to go back a little ways to perhaps one of the great revolutions of all time, which occurs in France in 1789. The culmination of centuries of unrest. So much different than just the American Revolution, which was against a country. It was an independence movement, the Great American Revolution. The American Revolution will in many ways inspire the French Revolution. But the French Revolution was a tidal wave of discontent and dissent against what was happening, or what had been happening in what was called the ancient or ancien regime, the old way of doing things that had lasted in Europe for 1,000 years, a medieval feudalistic order of things, which stressed three things: the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the theocracy of the church. And the great benefits of society went to those three entities, or institutions, however you wish to call it. And they had put down the common man and woman for so long. And the great battle cry of equality, fraternity, liberty, and property was what was happening in France. And actually it spills over for many years into Europe. But we would first have to understand that dramatic event in the French Revolution, which will in turn give rise to Napoleon, as one of the basic understandings of our age of 1820. The one who captures the spirit of a French Revolution, at least at the beginning, is going to be the man that the new republic, the French Republic, will turn to preserve itself, and that will be Napoleon Bonaparte. He's sometimes called the Prince of the Revolution, or the Son of the Revolution. And his efforts not only to quell revolts in France, but to expand the ideals of the revolution across Europe will have an enormous impact upon the history of Europe and of the entire world. He will pass to other nations a sense of that the people rule, not the monarchy, and certainly not the church, the established church, and certainly not the aristocracy. There must be a meritocracy. There must be an opportunity for the little person to succeed and to move forward. with all the criticisms of Napoleon, and surely he deserves a great many criticisms, the most egotistical, ambitious, prideful leader in so many ways, still the Napoleonic codes of law that will spread benefits not only to France but throughout Europe, a recognition of fairness in taxation, of better justice, of merit and not class, the abolition of serfdom, the abolition of Jewish ghettos, the desire to expand the freedom of conscience and of the individual. Much of that is in Napoleon's effort to expand the germs of the French Revolution, the seminal ideas of the French Revolution. Now he himself becomes an egotistical despot, an enlightened, unenlightened despot, however you wish to call it. He becomes France's first emperor. So here you have this tension of one who's supposedly going to tear down monarchy, but he becomes the first emperor. It's quite ironic. A man who's in love with himself, but in so many other ways accomplishes many of the dreams of the French Revolution. And the age of 1820 is an age of revolution, or it had been an age leading up to that, of raising the freedoms of many individuals and of nations as never before. The French Revolution was, in its most terrible extreme functions, a tearing down of 1,000 years of a way of living that was unfair. It was a moment where the commoner finally said, enough is enough. And although it had its terrible aspects, the guillotines and the executions of the royalty, and of maybe 50, 60,000 people. It was a bloodbath. It was a terrible bloodbath, but it was a statement by the people that we will not take it anymore. That the people are first, and the aristocracy and the monarchy and the church are second. It was a regurgitation to an apostate way of life in many ways, as we might see it in a religious context. And it had its ripples effect to this day. So what I'm trying to say is that the American Revolution was a great statement of the declarations of the freedom of men and women. But it wasn't this upheaval against an entire way of life for so many centuries. It was an independence movement, whereas the French Revolution was a regurgitation against all forms of society for so long that had been entrenched in French society and in European society that they would no longer tolerate. Napoleon carries the ideals of the French Revolution to some extent, more or less, into other parts of Europe, and spreads those concepts to other nations. In fact, it's going to be Napoleon, ironically, that will give rise to the German confederations and makes Germany become a nation, the modern nation that it is today. So you begin to see this. This is what I'm trying to say about Napoleon's impact upon the world of 1820. I think it's important to make connections to world events that will have an impact upon the Restoration. And one of those great world events is going to be the Congress of Vienna of 1815. Now, the Napoleonic Wars had been running from 1796 until the Battle of Waterloo. We all know about the Battle of Waterloo and the eventual destruction of Napoleon's forces. But it's the Congress of Vienna of 1815, which is led by 3 or 4 statesmen of the age. Castlereagh of England, Metternich of Austria, Tsar Alexander I and his Holy Alliance, which was, he saw it as a religious revelation as to the establishment of what is kind of like a precursor to the League of Nations 100 years later. These events establish a century of peace in Europe and throughout the world. The ending of the Napoleonic Wars, in one way, turned back the clock for some, thinking that they were going to try to erase or minimize many of the principles of the French Revolution, but they couldn't turn back the clock all the way. And the development of a balance of powers in Europe, the preservation of France, monarchy, but constitutional monarchies, which are much more restrained by the people. There's so much we could say about the Congress of Vienna, but the important thing from a restoration perspective is that it establishes an era of profound peace. One of the greatest statements of peace coming out of Europe in 1815, which will establish a time where the gospel could go forth rather than in a war-torn society, as we had seen just in the 20 years before. So I think that it's important to see the Congress of Vienna as a very important element. Even though it's far away and far removed from Palmyra, it will establish a time of peace that will last 100 years. Is that important? Is that part of the tenor of the time? Peace is very important. With the balance of powers forged at Vienna, it allows for the expansion of the British Empire in a way that had never been seen before. The rise of the British Navy, the Royal Navy, and the far-flung operations of the British in parts of the world never seen before will have enormous impact on the Christianization of the world. And you begin to see evangelism, or the evangelization of so many societies on the backs of the Royal Navy. Perhaps the great example of that is the great apostle to the Polynesian Islands, the Reverend John Williams of the London Missionary Society. He and the Reverend Carey and so many of those other great London Missionary Society missionaries who will spread the Christian gospel as they understood it to India, to China, and to the South Seas. A Protestant understanding of Christianity, but a marvelous one for its time and place. And what impact does that have on the future of the Restoration? I'm just asking the question, because later on we'll piggyback, we'll benefit from that effort. Further to the Christianization of the world, you see in England the rise of what you might call a vital Christianity, a very vigorous, muscular Christianity. And the two people that we recognize today, perhaps as the great advocates of that, would be William Wilberforce, who was converted in large part by Reverend Newton, who once was captain of slave ships, and the composer of that magnificent hymn, Amazing Grace, where he literally underwent a remarkable conversion, fearing for his own soul for the things that he had done as a younger man. And his impact upon William Wilberforce is of enormous significance to the eventual abolition of the slave trade. What this means is that the age of 1820 was a time of the rise of freedom. Not just revolution against thought, but the rise of the freedom of the common man. The abolition of the slave trade, the British slave trade in 1807, the African slave trade, was one of the most remarkable contributions of the 19th century. and was the inspiration later on for men like Abraham Lincoln and the abolition of the slavery in America later in the 19th century. But Wilberforce and his belief in what we would have to call vital Christianity, not just believing in something, but getting involved in the nitty-gritty of changing policy, because he was a parliamentarian, one of the greatest parliamentarians that England had ever known. And the help of the so-called Clapham sect in London. It would included people like Hannah More, whose pamphlets were read by the millions in Great Britain. And her belief in Christianity and the role of Christianity in changing individuals' lives cannot be underestimated in the impact of a changing world in Great Britain in the 1820s. And along with this vital Christianity was the birth of the British Foreign Bible Society in 1804, which will ride on the ships of the British Navy in the dissemination of literally hundreds of millions of copies of the Holy Bible, and the rise of the tract societies and literary societies to spread the gospel message without note or comment throughout the world. It was an age of the Christianization of the world. One cannot speak about the Christianization of society in the early 19th century without talking about the early revivals of John Wesley. John Wesley and the rise of the Methodist movement, which was a reaction against the formalities and the rigidities and the stiffness of the Church of England that many people could no longer accept as their emotional attachment to religion. And Wesley, perhaps more than any other man, revives the feelings of Christianity in the people. And his great message was one that religion must reach into the bar rooms and the barns of people to change them. And he will give thousands of sermons in his life. And people will flock to him like many have done with Billy Graham in our society today. And his revivals will change England, will save England, most scholars have argued, against a revolution like France went through, an economic revolution that would have changed England forever, perhaps for the worse. And so those revivals have a great saving impact upon British society. And by extension, with his terrific colleague, George Whitefield, and others coming to America. Wesley came to America and gave rise to the revivalist movements in early colonial America, and eventually to the Second Great Awakening, which will have an enormous impact upon Joseph Smith. The Methodist revivals of the early 1800s are really the catalyst for much of Joseph Smith's agitation over religion. The Second Great Awakening really begins in Kentucky, Cane Ridge, about 1801, when revivals, ministers from various religions would come together and the revivals would last 4 or 5 days in the countryside. And there were so many that came they'd have to build stages, and then they would put their pulpits. And one minister would speak to 1,000 people here, and another minister to another 1,000 people in here, and the call to repentance and to reformation was enormously significant in the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans who were aching for a religion that would change their lives. And that's the beginning of the Second Great Awakening, and it rides on the backs of the Methodist itinerant preachers particularly. Although Presbyterians were involved, Baptists were involved, it's the Methodists who are the the real catalysts for it, and the belief in individual conversion, truly individualistic and meaningful, a religion that is going to change their lives. And you see it in Jonathan Edwards earlier and in his great work in the revivals in New England that laid the groundwork for much of this. Later revivalism that will affect the prophet Joseph Smith. For some, religion never meant anything. Nevertheless, the Second Great Awakening does attract many who are looking for a deeply personal connection to God and to Scripture, and who are seeking salvation actively. And it was a very popular movement. We're not looking at just a few. We're looking, I'm not to say it would be a majority of Americans, but it was a very strong voice of those who were yearning for this kind of religious affection in their lives. And it's significant that 1820 is the 200th anniversary of the coming of the Pilgrims to the Plymouth Bay Colony. And you see that in the writings of many of the ministers contemporary to the prophet Joseph Smith, that we've kind of gone astray. We need to get back to that pilgrimage that's going to change our lives like it did earlier on in America. The big beginning for them, they thought of America was really a religious enterprise. And with the later Massachusetts Bay Colony, a city on a hill, a New Jerusalem. And this is what so much of the spirit of the revivals were in the 1820s, a New Jerusalem, to find out where we once were and where we need to become, and how America must change and go through that baptism of fire that's essential to its future salvation, both nationally and individually. The spirit of the age of 1820 is a spirit of improvement, an age of improvement. Now, it's an agonizing one and a wrenching one because it's going to have so many dislocations of many, many peoples. The Industrial Revolution that really begins in the late 1700s and continues on until about 1830, 1840 is going to have a wrenching impact upon where people live and how they live. It's going to be the beginning of the end of a rural lifestyle and the beginning of an urbanized one. But many people are going to be moving off the farms and into the cities where the factories are, where the machines are, where the steam-powered machines are. The Industrial Revolution will ride on the backs of the steam engine. And you'll see it in the great steam engines that will run the mills and factories of England. It will revitalize, transform transportation entirely into the iron horse of George Stephenson's Iron Horse. It comes out 1829, the rocket, the first one, that's going to transform transportation on land and steamships at sea. Transportation is going to become faster and easier. It's going to be advances in the health code of the people. People are going to live longer. People are going to eat better. It's going to be much more consumption of vegetables and better foods had been consumed in the past. And despite all the problems of the Industrial Revolution, it will change the world and eventually make the world a better place to live, an easier place to live. But it's an agonizing, wrenching change. But I'd have to agree with other greater scholars than I that it was the beginning of an age of improvement. And it's going to have enormous impact for the Restoration. How? By making travel easier, by making travel safer, by allowing for the rise of industrial societies and the spread of capitalism with all of its problems, more opportunities for more people to advance. Adam Smith's great Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, saw the potential for industrialization and how individuals can benefit from that, and for all the problems that it's brought about. A rise of a new capitalist age, which is going to allow for a greater dissemination of wealth and property. Arguably a benefit. Well, these are arguable things because you have Marxism and all kinds of other philosophies taking a different point of view. But these are things that are happening in the age that we're talking about. Another spirit of the age is that of scientific advancement. Now, there have been great advances in science for some time, but there are some spectacularly important things that are happening in the early 19th century that we would really have to examine carefully to understand how this new enlightenment, if you will, was changing the world. Let's first look at the rise of archaeology, particularly Egyptian archaeology and biblical archaeology. The name that comes to mind here is that of Jean-Francois Champollion, not Napoleon, but Champollion, sometimes called the man from Grenoble, Frenchman, perhaps the greatest linguist, not perhaps, indisputably the greatest linguist of the age. The French armies in their invasion of Egypt in 1798 had in the course of events discovered the Rosetta Stone, which lay undecoded for several years because of its difficulties. It was in 3 languages. To make a long story short, no one could decode the ancient hieroglyphics that were on the Rosetta Stone, let alone the heretics of medieval Egypt, and they could read the Egyptian, but they couldn't make the connection. And it took Champollion in September 1822, in his famous letter, where he finally proves that he can decode the Rosetta Stone. The significance? Mankind can now read ancient hieroglyphics. We owe that to Champollion. And with that comes the rise of a remarkable interest in Egyptology. And that will have enormous impact even on Joseph Smith, because eventually from that same area of the world we'll get the Book of Abraham. But for a worldwide purpose, the significance is going to be the rise of archaeology as a great new science, of Egyptian, or of Egyptology, and of biblical archaeology. And that's coming in large measure from Champollion's great work on the Rosetta Stone. So that's one area of scientific discovery and enlightenment which is significant to our story. You have to also look at the work of the great German scientist who is considered to be the Napoleon of science of his age, and that's Alexander von Humboldt, who in 1800 makes a remarkable expedition. It's financed by the Spanish crown to South America and Latin America. And his remarkable letters back to the French press, the German press, the British press, and his popularization of scientific discovery, which had really been motivated in the first instance by Captain Cook's great discoveries in the South Pacific, which really caught the imagination of the world. But Humboldt's exploits in South America as a zoologist, as a botanist, as a volcanologist, as the world's first great mountain climber, with his work with the Incas and the Aztecs, and his magnificent depictions and graphic descriptions of these places catches the attention of the world in such a way that when he returns after 4 years of an expedition to South America, he comes back to France like Lindbergh does to America. He had caught the imagination of an entire world and an entire generation, which we've long since forgotten. But he will popularize science like no man had ever done before, and will encourage, therefore, the rise of whole new areas of study in science. In many ways, he is the father of modern science, certainly of 19th century science. And you will begin to see discoveries which he himself will finance and support in the world's electromagnetism and electricity, the works of Faraday, Volta, remember? And the advances in electricity, including Alessandro Volta's battery voltaic pile, or battery, and André Ampère's electrodynamics, and Michael Faraday, the first electric motor, all happening in the 1820s. The beginning of modern electrical power. Some could even argue it was the beginning of the computer age. The independence movements. We well know the independence movement in America, with Thomas Jefferson, the founding fathers of the United States, having enormous impact upon the future political landscape of America and its impact in the early 19th century. But most people may not understand the great independence movements elsewhere in the world that were happening. It was a movement, a worldwide movement that we have to understand. And perhaps the greatest expression of that is Simón Bolívar in South America. Bolívar of Venezuela is called to this day the great liberator in South America. Inspired in part by the American independence movement and also by the French independence movement. He did know Napoleon. He had met him on a couple of occasions, but it's going to be Bolívar and his wars of liberation that will extend from Venezuela to Bolivia, to New Granada or Colombia, to Peru, to Ecuador. The great independence movements of South America, all happening in our period of history in the early 19th century. You must look at Bolívar as being one of the great statesmen of independence. He was a magnificent warrior. His marches over the Andes, the Andes Mountains, and how they came around to attack the Spanish armies from the rear after 2,000-mile march is an incredible feat in military history, unknown by many. He failed in his hope for the unification of all states in South America into one country, but his independence movement to this day is one that we must remember and is to be heralded. Even affects Central America and Mexico, which becomes independent in 1819 of the Spanish rule. The aristocracy of Spanish rule, the monarchy, is that which Bolívar will overthrow successfully. So you're seeing independence not only in Europe, you're seeing it in America, and you're seeing it in Latin America and South America. You see it also in the arts. This expression of independence is very difficult to define what Romanticism was in literature and in music and in art. But most scholars would probably agree that it was a reaction to the formal rigidities of classical thinking, that it was going to be the rise of individual feelings and emotions rather than an institutionalized way of expressing things. And you see that in some of the great painters. You certainly see it in de Goya, the great Spanish artist. You see it perhaps in Beethoven, in his magnificent symphonies, which had the Napoleonic battles in the background, where it's this anthem to the common person, the Ninth Symphony, the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God. The Ninth Symphony is an anthem to that, and a tearing down of the despotic regime that had once put them down. You see that in perhaps Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge and the writings of the great literary masters of the age, the freedom of the will and the emotions that are so important to be expressed. That man is an agent and not one just to be acted upon. That man and woman can be decisive and can make the choices that are critical to their own happiness. That seems to be a theme in the Romantic Age. And does it spill over to the Restoration? Certainly the Restoration will require that expression of individual yearning and feeling and emotion. Ironically, one of the greatest expressions of toleration is going to be Napoleon Bonaparte. He will abolish the vestiges of the Spanish and Italian Inquisitions. He will abolish the Jewish ghettos. He will abolish serfdom where he can find it. He will tolerate many religions. He almost abolishes the Catholic Church in France, which was an expression of the French Revolution. The Notre Dame Cathedral becomes a temple of reason. The whole Christian calendar is abolished. And it took Napoleon finally to, well, that's went a little too far, but he was a great advocate of toleration for many different nations and many different nationalities, which really opened up an age of toleration, ironically, from one who was as despotic as he was. I mean, that's a true statement. The abolition of the ghettos under Napoleon, we want to forget that. And the Inquisitions, he hated all of that. He wanted to raise up the common man. There was no privileged class in his military. You earned your way by your courage, and by your individual strengths and fortitudes. He was an egotistical emperor, I'll say that much to him, but the code of law that was established in many nations that put a premium on a fair justice system and fair taxation, that's a real heritage of Napoleon. I know I'm going to get a lot of criticism for this, but I think his son is on the rise. The spirit of the age for America in some ways in 1820 wasn't the President of the United States, it was most likely that of the great compromiser, Henry Clay, longtime Speaker of the House. The great debating issue of 1820 was the bringing of Missouri into the nation. And the United States almost comes to civil war in 1820 over the divisive issue of Missouri becoming a state. The South wanted balance in the Senate, and they wanted to maintain that peculiar institution of slavery, as Kenneth Stamp in his great book has described it. But it took a man who was from the South, from Kentucky, Henry Clay, to forge a compromise. We'll have to do something here to save this nation. And finally, it's going to be the M&M. We'll let Missouri come in if we split Massachusetts into Maine and Massachusetts. So the North can have Maine and the South can have Missouri. There are many other ramifications to the compromise of 1820. But it took a spirit of compromise to save the nation. And that spirit is in America in 1820. Well, I suppose that the independence movement could also be expressed in the United States with the War of 1812, which was another war of independence, in a sense. It was a war between Great Britain and America, which ended really at best in a compromise situation for both sides. But it did open up the Mississippi River Valley to American expansion. And you see in the post-1812 era in American history a country on the move west. Over the hills and mountains of the Alleghenies, over the Cumberland Gap, down through the rivers, the Ohio River Valley, what have you. It's an America on the move. The invitation to move west was they could not resist it. And you see that even with the Smith family coming from Vermont in 1816. It's part of this movement to go west from difficult farming countries in Vermont to the west. And the west would be west to New York at that particular time, where farming was easier than it had been in New England. And so clearly this independence movement and the rise of a restless, agitated populace in America is going to have enormous impact even on the Smith family. It's part and parcel of this movement west, to find new land, new independence. The War of 1812 will give rise to the nation of Canada eventually, because the British arguably win the War of 1812. There's a great argument who won the war. It was a stalemate, but the fact that the British and Canada survived means that they're going to survive to become a nation. And so that's going to be a great heritage of the War of 1812, will be the rise of Canada. But it's also going to be the rise of the West in the United States, to fill up the lands of the Mississippi and further west. And the church will ride on that wave westward. Arguably, the most influential man of the age of 1820 is Napoleon, who will die in the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, in exile, in 1821. It was the conclusion of an enormously rich period in mankind's history, humankind's history. And to this day is considered to be the towering figure of 1820 for the dissemination of the principles of the French Revolution, and for the enormous military strategist that he was. Changed the world forever. But there were other great names. We'd have to mention Alexander von Humboldt, who died shortly thereafter. We'd have to mention Beethoven, who was commissioned about that time to write his magnificent Ninth Symphony, and becomes the capstone of a magnificent career. Who could ever surpass such heights in music as Beethoven? You probably would have to mention Wordsworth and Coleridge in literature for their magnificent lyrical ballads, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, so many other the great poems of the age that are coming out of England. You'd probably have to mention Géricault, one of the great artists of his time, and his Raft of the Medusa, and David in France, and some of the great artists of the time. You'd have to mention those magnificent romantic artists. You'd probably have to mention Champollion and his work in Egypt in the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone, which took a while for the world to catch on to the significance of that. But today, the rise of modern archaeology, biblical archaeology, Egyptology, one of the greatest contributions of that time. You'd have to mention Watt and Stevenson and their magnificent works with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the machine, the steam-driven power machines on rail and at sea and in factories that will change the world forever. All of that's happening in our age and time. You'd have to mention Simon Bolivar and the independence movement in South America and Latin America, and the tearing down of a Spanish theocracy that had subjugated millions of people for too long in South and Latin America. You'd have to mention Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, who, as I recall, died, I think, on the same day, July the 4th, 1826. those names would be synonymous with greatness in America. Still are. And you'd have to mention Tsar Alexander I, the great Russian Tsar, who is the morning star. He's sometimes called the morning star of the age, because it's Tsar Alexander who, with the help of so many other nations, will conquer Napoleon. And Europe's morning star will be a founder of the French of the Congress of Vienna. But his dream, his religious dream of a holy alliance, that mankind can come to tables of peace and compromise and work out a lasting peace, which in many ways is what Castlereagh and Metternich do in the Congress of Vienna of 1815, along with Tsar Alexander I. These are great statesmen of the age, which laid a foundation for peace for 100 years.